Hey there, folks. So welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the sophomore album from Joey Bada called All-American Badass. So I have to be honest, I wasn't really sure where Joey Bada is going to be taking this new sophomore project. I mean, I wasn't exactly surprised he was pivoting towards a more political, socially aware sound as Buzz was suggesting. It seemed like a natural stepping off point, especially given that his mixtapes and a full-length debut Before the Money in 2015 made that progression seem almost inevitable. After all, many of those older MCs that he idolized in a lot of his production and flows and style did pivot to making more conscious music. It really is a sensible and rather quite mature step. But here's the other truth. I haven't exactly listened to a lot of Joey Bada since he dropped his full-length debut in very early 2015. Part of this might have been bad timing. I covered his record in between hip-hop albums from Lupe Fiasco, Tetsuo and Youth, and All Hands by Doomtree. And I have to admit, he might have gotten overshadowed in my mind and on a lot of my playlists because of that. Which isn't really fair, because he's a great rapper with a knack for textured, old-school East Coast production, and then some insightful, layered bars and some great songs. And for a lot of people, this is probably going to happen again. This time with Kendrick Lamar dropping his newest album, Damn, off the back of a huge single in the Hot 100. In short, Joey Bada has just had some rotten luck in terms of timing, and thus I wanted to ensure I gave this record its due before everybody forgets about it, like what would happen with Drake a few weeks ago. And while I bet for a bunch of you that was the first time you thought about More Life in some time, let's stick to the subject at hand. How is All-American Badass? Well, here's the weird thing. I can see this album being simultaneously accessible and yet divisive among fans new and old. Hell, probably even among a lot of critics too. And it's a funny thing because in comparing this to Before the Money, I like All-American Badass about as much as I did that debut, in that it's a great hip-hop album that showcases a lot of good taste, sharp writing, and great production, but I like it for very different reasons. Now, part of this was inevitable because of the change in direction of a lot of the content, but I'd argue it runs a little bit deeper than that, and I can predict that while it might not have the same punchline density that attracted some hardcore hip-hop heads, if they can accept that shift, they'll find a lot to love on this album, because yeah, it really is that great. I think it will get a lot of fans. So let's start off with talking about that shift, and a significant part of it begins with Joey Bada himself. Longtime listeners will immediately notice that for as many double entendres as he tends to cram into so many of his bars and punchlines, there's a fair bit less of them this time around. He's aiming to be a lot more straightforward and effective and direct, speak directly to the political subjects at hand, and even bring along a more wavy, melodic approach for a lot of the hooks. Now, that's not saying the punchlines or double entendres aren't there, especially in the darker second half of this album when he brings in more guest stars, and his album moves into slightly more conventional for Joey Bada material, but you can also tell that he's much more concerned at ensuring that the message is very clear and comprehensive for his entire audience. And honestly, I'm a big fan of this approach, especially when it comes to making more political art, because it enables his statements to feel both more populist and get directly to the point, get a lot more precise. And what's telling is that he necessarily shows how much of a message can become both weapon and a duty for him. For My People sets the stage with that dispirited yet realistic trudged incredibly well, especially bringing to mind a lot of the superhero imagery, which makes a lot of sense, and then following it with Temptation to show how his own position isn't just fraught with vices, but by a system that's stacked to paint him as a villain despite, from everything I can tell, genuine altruism. And you know what? He's under no illusions that this isn't a complex, multifaceted problem that he might not be able to fix on his own. From systemic poverty to failures of education to police abuse to the rewriting of black history to politicians who have repeatedly let down the community and enabled the abuse of power, to highlight on songs like Why You Don't Love Me, Miss America, how it can feel like black people aren't even wanted or welcome in their own country, flipping what could be a song about unrequited love into something that's much bigger and much more potent. Now, I've also heard some critics and some fans criticize this album for seeming, well, a little bit too straightforward at points, retracing political ground that has already been touched on without adding new texture or ideas, especially from older rappers that he idolizes, because it can feel all the more apparent given Joey Badass's preference for an older sound and an older production style. And while I guess I could see some credence in that comment, there's several things I could also say that will blow that right out of the gate. For one, it's very telling that people bring up these comments when it touches on social commentary for which they're expected to engage and fight the system or feel bad for not engaging, in comparison to the upteeth banger that asks and demands nothing of the audience. And for another, it does a disservice to the spots where Joey Badass does bring in more subtlety in his commentary, which I thought they would otherwise like. Take Super Predator, getting a solid verse from Styles P. Where the hell has he been? I've missed him. And it's very telling how Joey Badass draws that parallel between how the more aggressive he becomes in his naturally competitive brand of old school hip hop, the more the system is inclined to view him as a threat. The sort of contradiction that doesn't help in a system that's set against him already. Or take the extended closing track American Idol, where he identifies how they need to make more of an effort to enact change and real revolution if necessary, but they need to be really damn careful how they do it, as there are certain racist elements in the government that are just looking for that next excuse to crack down on a population that's being actively fed lies to sedate them right now. And again, given that some of the blatant elements of white nationalism affecting the US federal government like syphilis right now, it's not like he's wrong here. And that's another point that really needs to be stressed. Joey Badass, he might be walking a road that his idol Tupac helped pave, but it's not like the systemic issues have gone away. And it's no surprise the album ends on a pretty dark note, seeming to imply that without change, things are only gonna get worse. That said, there are some points where I feel that this record can skim kinda close to conspiracy theory territory, with a chemtrails reference on Babylon. Q-Tip did this too on their last album with A Tribe Called Quest. I don't know why they keep bringing this up. It's not true. Or that can feel a little bit scattershot in some of the political commentary, like the J. Cole collaboration on Legendary, that seems to emphasize a drive towards transcendence that J. Cole's self-doubt and questioning seems to render a little bit awkward. Then there's Devastated. Honestly, it just isn't in the same ballpark conceptually or lyrically to match the rest of this project. It's easily the most commercial and forgettable cut on this record. Hell, compare this to Rockabye Baby with ScHoolboy Q, which might as well be the spiritual successor to Gang Bang Anyway from The Game only 2 years ago, which remains one of my favorite gangster rap songs of the decade and highlights similar themes of black unification and responsibilities that the Crips and Bloods should have to come together and fight the much bigger enemy. But circling back to Tupac, it was also something that crept through in a lot of the production and a lot of the sound of this album, calling back to a very mid-90s tone of gangster rap that has deeper, more lush tones of jazz rap that might not have the same grit as Before the Money, but also has the texture and managed to pick up some of his best ever melodies and hooks for Joey Badass. And the great thing is how effective the flow and build-up through the first few songs are. Kinda low-key, but it really works. Hints of gentle liquid organ and synth tones building against a thicker bass and drum pattern that never feels the need to get too hard, all against a cushion of backing vocals and layered horns and touches of guitar all throughout Good Morning America for My People, finally hitting the biggest climax against the thicker bass on Temptation and the utterly heartbreaking vocal samples that bookend that song. A little emotionally manipulative, sure, but yeah, it really works. It's a phenomenal way to open up this album. I will say I was a little bit disappointed that Land of the Free, despite some great content, couldn't quite hold up the momentum thanks to that slowed down outro that did linger a little long, or the persistent hollow feeling of the mix across Devastated, even despite a pretty slick guitar line that I like there, but between the airy balance of the bass, the strings, and the touches of backing vocals against a phenomenal drum line and some sweet horns on Why Don't You Love Me, Miss America, things are very quickly back on track. From there, the record does take a bit of a darker turn on its second half, courtesy of the sharper piano sample and menacing bass on Rockabye Baby, or the cracking atonal keyboard samples against the stormy darkness, noisier beat, and scratches of Ring the Alarm. Although, you know what, I gotta admit, when we got Static Selector producing for Super Predator with the lush horns and great snare and the bass, I don't mind the sonic pivot if it's gonna get a little bit later at all. It sounded fantastic. Hell, I just wish I felt more of Static's more damp production on Legendary. I wish it clicked for me better. Thankfully, DJ Khalil manages to blend in the guitar tones against the echoing kick drum amazingly well on the closer American Idol to hit a killer conclusion, especially with the touches of glitch and vocal effects that emphasize that bleak finale. That might feel a little bit more futuristic than you would expect for Joey Badass, but yeah, it really worked, setting the stage for that future. In short, if you can't tell, I'm really digging this project. I actually had a fair bit more to say about it than I otherwise expected. And the sad fact is, again, I think this album's gonna end up getting overlooked. Not just by those anticipating Kendrick, by those who will dismiss conscious rap because it means a smoother, more groove-heavy, possibly even more accessible experience that had a few less punchlines that were clever for their own sake. But as a whole, I'd argue this is a great album, easily netting an 8 out of 10 for me, and definitely a recommendation if you appreciate this brand of conscious, old-school hip-hop with great hooks and phenomenal vibes. And if Joey Bada, he wants to continue his pivot in this direction, maybe even opt to take that storytelling a little bit deeper with that conscious angle where I think he could have done a little more, I'm definitely looking forward to it. So for sure, check this out. You don't want to miss it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I'm surprised I had so much to say about this record, but hey, if you guys want to hear more, or actually want to hear the record, the link to buy it's in the description below, and the poll right there, if you guys want to have any debate about it, right over there. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get more involved in my scheduling process, the link to my Patreon is right there. I feel like I get questions about this all the time, so here's how you do it. We'll click on my Patreon for the lower contributors. 3 times a week, you guys get to vote on the records coming up on my schedule. And once a week on Saturdays for the Patreon, for the higher level, you guys get to add records or even movies to my schedule. More details right there in the link. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.